Our study in the book of Genesis continues today with Genesis chapter 24. I've titled this devotional, Here Comes the Bride, a Wife for Isaac. Would you follow with me in Genesis 24? Well, the Lord, faithful to his promises, had blessed Sarah in her old age. Now at 90, she had given birth to a son when Abraham was 100 years old. And yet, incredibly, she lived to be 127 years old, meaning Isaac was 37 at the time of his mother's death. Well, that brings us to Genesis 24. And here we find in the opening verses an urgency to find Isaac a suitable wife. Now we read, Abraham was old and well stricken in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. In other words, all that God had promised had come to pass. Now, 3 years were passed since Sarah's death. Genesis 23 and 1, Genesis 25 and 20. Abraham, knowing his days upon the earth were drawing to a close, was impressed with an urgency to prepare his son to become not only the master of the household, but also the heir of God's covenant. Now, an essential part of that preparation was choosing a suitable wife for Isaac. Now, burdened that Isaac would have a fitting wife, Abraham summoned his eldest servant in 24 and verse 2 and charged him that Isaac, and I quote, shall not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, and that is a heathen idolatrous people who lived in the land. In verse 4, but thou shalt go into my country, now that's the country out of which God had called him, and to my kindred, and to take a wife unto my son Isaac. And so the concern of Abraham was that Isaac would not marry a heathen idolatrous wife, knowing the influence that could have upon his son. Therefore, he found it urgent to send the servant to find a wife for Isaac among those who called upon the God of heaven. Now, the servant questioned Abraham concerning the considerations for choosing Isaac's wife, and he was admonished that should a young woman be unwilling to return with him to Canaan, he must not permit Isaac to leave the land God had given him as an inheritance. Genesis 24 and verse 6 through 9. And so we have recorded then, beginning in verse 10 through verse 67, Abraham's servant's journey to search for Isaac's wife. Now, we read that there was a caravan of 10 camels, servants, and supplies accompanied Abraham's trusted servant for the 500-mile journey across the desert from Canaan to the city of Nahor in Mesopotamia. Now, arriving at the well in Nahor in the evening, we read that the servant was aware that the young women of the household would come to the well for water. And there he compelled his camels, to kneel. Now, Abraham's servant then prayed to the Lord for him, the Lord, to guide him and show kindness, he said, unto my master Abraham. Chapter 24 and verse 12. And then we read, before he had done speaking, Rebekah came out, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, with her pitcher upon her shoulder. Here we have then the providence of God. The servant was led to Rebekah. Let's follow it, verses 16 through 28. Now Rebekah was the Lord's answer to the servant's prayer, and we read, for she was very fair to look upon, a virgin. Neither had any man known her. And she went down to the well and filled her pitcher, and then she came up. Verse 16. Now we read in verse 16 that she was beautiful and chaste, that is, she was a virgin, pure. She was considerate, verse 18. And we also find that she was diligent in serving and of a household that called on Jehovah. The servant then rewarded Rebekah with, we read, a golden earring of half a shekel weight and 2 bracelets for her hands of 10 shekels weight of gold. Verse 22. Now when the servant learned she was of the household of Nahor, now Nahor being Abraham's brother and his son both were named Nahor. We read that the servant lifted up his voice in praise and thanksgiving, and he testified, and I quote, "I, being in the way, the Lord led me to the house of my master's brethren." Genesis 24, verse 27. There have been many times in life that I have pondered, I being in the way, the Lord led me. Maybe you are at a place in life you're searching for what is God's will, what is God's plan. And I have always found that God leads us as we are in the way of his will. And so it was for the servant. Well, following the custom of the ancient East, Rebekah invited Abraham's servant to her household, where he was provided lodging, and met Laban, Rebekah's brother. Now, we're going to learn later, Laban is quite a rascal. However, in this case, we are introduced to him. Then we come to verses 29 through 67, where we have a covenant of marriage established. Now, the servant refused to be comforted by food or shelter until he stated his mission and testified how God providentially led him to their home, the home of Nahor, the home of Laban, the home of Rebekah. He declared, verse 34, "I am Abraham's servant." Now you can imagine all these years that have gone by, and suddenly Abraham's name returns. He then, the servant, shared how God had blessed his master with great wealth in verse 35, and a son who would be his heir. Well, hearing God had providentially led the servant to Rebekah, her brother and her father offered their blessing for her, Rebekah, to become Isaac's wife. Now, when Rebekah was requested to give her consent to depart with Abraham's servant and become the wife of Isaac, she consented and said, in verse 58, "I will go." Well, with the blessing of her family, we read that Rebekah departed with her attendant and journeyed with Abraham's servant to Canaan. Now, as they neared the journey end, they spotted Isaac approaching them. Now, Rebekah, we read, dismounted from the camel, bowed to Isaac, covered herself with a veil, expressing modesty and humility in verses 64 and 65. And then, after hearing the servant's report and how the Lord led him, the servant, to Rebekah, we read, Isaac brought her, Rebekah, into his mother Sarah's tent, and she became his wife, and he loved her. Well, closing thoughts for today. Though their marriage was not always a picture of peace and happiness, Isaac and Rebekah's union has served as an enduring testimony of God's interest in our lives and his providential leadership in our marriages and families. Indeed, you and I should be inspired to walk in righteousness and say with Abraham's servant, "I being in the way, the Lord led me." Here's a challenge. Do right, and you will not only do the will of the Lord, but be confident in it. Well, God bless. Thank you for being a part of our study, and bye-bye.